The following information has been sourced from interview sites, the magazine ReSearch, Rolling Stones, Wikipedia, and etc. But some of the stuff presented is also my interpretation, and a mild pseudo-poetic exaggerations. Be warned, it is far from perfect and even far from good. The man and culture. Things a man cannot live without, getting bored to sleep. It is an essence of life that gives our world a sort of a magical, surreal flair of interest, bizarreness, sorrow, and happiness that is just inaccessible to us in the regular world. But what if this entertainment came not from our fantasies, but from our workplace and machinery? What if the instruments of our daily lives, of those which help to do various things from stapling, welding, connecting, reinforcing, or demolishing? What if they're a social metaphor of a very system that forces us to carve and build and to eat? This is the story of a man in creating a critique disguised as a broad and conventional sound. The subject of this video, that being the industrial music and its origins, can be boiled down and traced down to a highly influential industrial revolution in Europe in 1760s and onwards. But before it happened, it was all a man and his donkey, for work and hauling and much more. It was not necessarily a slavery act. It was a highly selfless move. Essentially and in a nutshell, the process of industries were comprised of a tactic of silently and indirectly folding a man and capturing him in the hands of rich and wealthy, by showing him the consequences of his uncooperative decisions, which would grow and manifest as hunger, suicide, and depression. All of this was made and done in order to produce the means of living, and not only that, the industrial culture also facilitated intrusions of other spheres, like war and general healthcare, offering accessibility and would be due to slightly low payout rates. The industrial landscape would provide to be a heavenly hellhole to average Samaritan or Joe. Accidents, poor conditions, diseases, and many more would drive many to the edge. But for a man destined to sacrifice himself for a family or just a loved one, it would be a perfect filler for his poverty, and it would at least give him a temporary requiem for his unsalvageable and irrecoverable destiny. This system involuntarily but effectively forces citizens to become an indirect bootlicker to the state and its leaders, decreasing his or her morals, energy, happiness, and life, in return that someday he or she would dominate the crown of or being a golden family man/woman. Only in reality for a man to be an unfortunate manufacturer and provider to a high echelon who care about him just as much as we care about their last supper of expensive food that a rich would consume every day like it was nothing. What I'm saying here is that these souls were nothing but manufacturing sentient sculptures, and not prize citizens that were providing crafted goods with their own dirty and blessed hands, only for these things to be used by the elite and be assessed in wars and domination plans for other countries, where actual slavery would happen. The Industrial Revolution put a spin on things, with not just a voluntarily slavery system, but also a gimmick, which would make things more artificial. Say hello to the machines of working race. This age would give the workplace settlers metallic and stationary tools, which would be a step up from agricultural slavery in the past in other countries, keeping them weaponized and more mechanical than before. But this was also a shadow of the tactics and traits of the upper class of society. This marked a transition from soft to vulgar plantations to harsh and cold, potentially dangerous environments of warehouses that faced Europe in 18th and 19th century. It symbolized that the rich literally gave sacrifices to the machines in order to build their empire stronger and to boost their fancy egos/images even more. Keep the machinery in mind, as it will come handy later on. While most of Europe had been reshaped by industrialization, for better and worse, some parts have just arisen in terms of industrial factors in recent years. The art genre of Dadaism, a legendary precursor for many modern shitposts, and generally being a predecessor to not so great abstract art, and also surrealism. The only sentence that describes this art is basically backyard trolling, because the artist would literally pull anything that they created and would classify it as art. But that effect was achieved with hands, and most importantly, interventions of machines. The very basis of an existence of Dadaism would challenge many factors of the traditional and orthodox rules of art. Why showcase something that is hand-painted when it can be sculpted and aggravate somebody with it? It's beautiful and hilarious in the sense that anything could be on a spotlight and be still be hailed as masterpiece. Artists like Marcel Duchamp and Paul Cabaret Voltaire Club in Europe not only dared to oppose the standards but to oppose the meantime wars and atrocities by smearing the image and conceptions of what could be art and what art could represent in its purest and harshest form, while still dealing a blow and a message to the wars and atrocities in the system. And in a way, this movement is very pseudo-anarchic and proto-punk in a sense. The industrial music's main sword and shield would firstly be machinery, and secondly, the shield that would set would of course be Dadaism. In a sense, this provocative and very critical style of harsh music is crowned as Dadaistic for being very unorthodox and not belonging in the genre as a means of rebellion, similar to how Dadaism functions. This would not be something that a regular petty person would enjoy, but rather a memoir of appreciation for those who have exhausted their hands to the industrial landscape. A reminder that somebody's willpower has been strained, all for creation to be either weaponized or be enforced and utilized in elite circles. The streets of buildings, warehouses that were abandoned, and the decay that ensued on society would be a cynic or not so cynic reminder of capitalism and the main focal point at which industrial music criticizes so much. And finally, our story begins in 1975 with the UK band Throbbing Gristle. If we ever dwelled at least on a surface level of the industrial music genre, you probably all heard of the same stories. After band Throbbing Gristle was the start. Throbbing Gristle that and Gristle that. However, Genesis P. O'Reilly, the person who founded the Throbbing Gristle band and is considered a pioneer in the genre, actually created something much more artistically broken and incoherent, but deeply very experimental. In fact, it was the dawn of the experimental genre, as we know of today. Coom Transmissions was the name of a project, founded in 1969. The band's main orientation centered towards making very mangled sounds surrounding life and environment, along with the sounds of torn instruments. This collage of sounds would be a gateway to the genre of industrial music. Although unlike industrial, Coom wasn't making a statement but rather an anti-art piece. For Genesis, music was taking place as opposed to other factors like expressiveness. She didn't even claim that she invented the genre in the first place. That there were many people with the same expressions and ideas, and although she broke them out in Wilderness first. Dropping Coom and forming a band with Cosi Vanni Tutti, Chris Carter and Peter Christopherson, called Throbbing Gristle. Founded in the busy laters of Kingston City, in the UK, its main goal was to decorate the music scene by adding very visceral and unconventional sounds. Sounds that were a crude interpretation or representation of society's downfall and decay. Releasing the first album in 1975, titled The First Annual Report, which will be released as bootleg in the 1980s, and a follow-up in 1977 called The Second Annual Report. These albums would share a fate akin to that of John Carpenter's movies, where initially it was just a classic in the outcast circles. However, with the passing time, it would get credited as being revolutionaries in the genre. Big bands like Nine Inch Nails, Trent Reznor credited Genesis as an inspiration. The musical experience itself with his albums is very shallow, disorganized, crude, and deafening in some places. However, a deep listen to any of his sounds is like hearing a relaxing sound coming from a snail shell, or an Arabic mosque chanting. You can't understand nor grasp it. It unnerves you and it confuses you at first due to how blunt it is. But when it grows on you and you want more, this is not psychedelic music because this is a drug itself. A drug which distorts and opens the eyes at the same time. A drug which samples and recollects the moments of urban decay. The structure of his albums and songs is just god-awful. At first it sounds like a chant, then electropop, then rock, then repeat of these three, which makes it very diverse but messy and disorientating to listen to. But then again, these are not the sounds for those who want to listen to this with their headphones tilted and buds plugged. No. This is a sound of a place many have been through physically and it is retold to you in abstract and triple way. This is the sound of an effect of society's downfall and corporative decay. A radiating sense of sourness, rotting sadness, engulfs these albums, as if it has been consumed by something. Heavy distortions and static travel through the sounds of these albums, but they're not as overwhelming as, let's say, noise music. You can still make out the distinctiveness and dire sadness in the sound of this music. A bold and brave moves from the artist's behalf would continue with 20 Just Funk greats, a beta album, and lastly, DOA, the third and the final report. Cultivating a sound which no other band had made at the time, or in our case, didn't bother to make. Genesis commented in r/Search magazine that people always try to copy greatness, only for them to fall redundant and be uninspired at the very least. Her goal was to bring originality, even if it wasn't necessarily traditional form of music. She was essentially the carrier of Dadaism into the music, producing static and sounds without layers, that turned into harmonizing yet sorrowful and subliminally meaningful tunes by the midpoint. Her criticism of pop music was that people tend to crown themselves and put themselves on the same levels as the pioneer of a genre, without adding any of their own taste to the music. Simply put, Genesis went above and beyond that cliché by creating the genre itself, not lazily joining it, and not like our others, who are adding no sort of variation and grand style. Twice, in fact, with Coombe and Throbbing Gristle. Without Genesis and Gristle, there would be no Skinny Puppy, no Nine Inch Nails, no injection of industrial music into the realm of entertainment. You name it. The contents of his lyrics of songs that TJ made were usually comprised of provocative stuff like murder, genocide, and more. Although Commoner may say that this is borderline edgy and distastefully trash, the lyrical styles of his albums encompass a broad critique of urban decay, corporative takeover, and how desperation of oneself dehumanizes them to a horrid degree. And additionally, Genesis offers an explanation that these horrid acts could be someone else's pathetic hobby, or that those principles of murder could apply to random common people, with the notion of them being deserved of these acts. The acts which have been caused by the aforementioned decay. Taking its very metaphorical and physical manifestation to its extremes, of course. The term industrial music originated from an associate of Throbbing Gristle, called Monty Azaza, a provocative shock artist waiting for a moment of obscenity to strike. He came up with the term industrial, which originally was going to be labeled as factory music, in which it was a peerage would be soulless and empty. While industrial as a term meant a lot of stuff like, for example, industrial music, industrial work, industrial fashion, in general industry itself is a place of people and connections. While a factory is only tempting to look at and full of life, when it is full and operational. Griswold Band spawned many contemporary clones such as Clock GVA, Test Depth, Clinic, SPK, and many more. Many of the artists in the genre did add or subtract the elements of the music that Genesis enveloped deep into the entertainment genre, for better or for worse. As a side note, Genesis Peerage has unfortunately passed away last year, March 2014, from leukemia. Rest in peace, legend. You will be missed. Much like punk and psychedelic genres, the industrial genre was made to be an arrow in the ass against capitalism, blandness, unoriginality, conservative regime, and the male art people, which were desecrating the art industry with disposable, generic, and dispensable content in art forms, which were catering to a crowd of heteronormative, primitivists, and the bigots with frail masculinity and tiny minds, desperately trying to become the next Stallone or Arnie. This only got worse in the 80s. Braggadocious and smug on being these keen rebels, in reality the culture and art society of the 70s were nothing more but a conservative and authoritarian beehive, centered towards making big money with replaceable assets and art pieces. This system was looking at great disdain in anything that was considered unusual, /unorthodox, or even slightly experimental in the art genre, thus removing such pieces of art from a mainstream spotlight and simultaneously brainwashing the people with mediocre power fantasy art forms and pieces. What did not help at the time was the capitalism's attempts to use the retextured mask of orderly Christian movements and churches, who were strong sinners and hypocrites themselves, acting as the sole gate guardians to the society and art genre while borrowing and bowing down to millionaires and embezzling thieves. All the while corporations and corrupt governments were infesting the societies and forcing people to put themselves into potentially life-threatening and desensitizing situations for them to earn a dime or to become at least somewhat successful. All the while getting minimum wage and slowly having the decreasing mental fortitude and brain power to operate. This situation was vastly represented in the art forms of underground style and culture, by showing and displaying the scrutinized and enforced lifestyle which was forced upon by the top dogs in the system. The mainstream art was just a blanket for a highly constructive and overly authoritarian, pseudo-Christian, extremely capitalist and fragile mindset of rules of presentation. The result boiled down to work so backheaded and accessible that you would think it was actually a generic minimalist movement in disguise of a portentous mind, trying as hard as to create a disposable piece of art, entertainment. They were keen on removing interest and life from the art piece, and art in general. The early industrial music works also took inspirations from mind games and information warfare, carried out by government agencies against anyone with a living tissue. These bands would incorporate sounds that would seem fit in a torture room rather than a living one, while Fabric Grisel and Monte Cazaza would emulate the sounds of urban decay, gruesome warehouses, and bleakness of world around them. Their work, was simply put, was never simple. In the same realm, there existed a different style of provocation, with style of simplicity and singularity. The man behind the simplicity was called Zev, aka Stefan Joel Weiser, a poet, percussionist, and instrumentalist born in 1951 America. He presented the music in an unorthodox manner, by not just adding or inserting or even modifying elements of music, but by having only one element in his pocket, and that was percussions. Just raw percussions emanating from the arches of the industrial materials. This model of word simplicity would prove to be more unpopular and even more niche. Whereas Grisel employed the use of one-octave keyboards and bass guitars, Zev's instruments were sublimated to absolute singularity in a musical sense, whilst being very diverse with selection of tools. This included bottles, metal rods, tubes, pans, and many more non-conventional sound tools. With some will be born from flinging, rather than tastefully putting or hitting a drum or wailing hands on guitar. And the products sounded exactly as you would expect: blunt, harsh, raw, and uncooked. The main opposition factor in faction was the presence of President Ronald Reagan's military-industrial complex, was arming itself against the enemies of the so-called Soviet front, be it with space tech or nuclear bombs, which ultimately proved disastrous to small-time jobs and economy of the country in general. The sound of Zev wasn't just a random collage of various things, being crammed and strung together in order to make a bang and a noise. The point of Zev and his simplicity was to oppose consumerism. It showed that you didn't need the latest technology and equipment to make a tune. A basic item capable of making a fart on the wall was enough to fill a cassette tape with sound. This philosophy was effectively broadening the audience of music and making it more accessible for everyone to make and produce their own tracks, which will remove the need to be in the higher ups of the show businesses. These performances were just the typical dance moves of a regular artist or an idol. They were simply crude risk shows, a performances of classic entities and items, which delivers a subliminally poetic blow to anybody who listens to it. Sometimes music by the spectators and critics was described stylistically as being controlled by a puppeteer or strings. The main tactic for Zev was cultural subversion, aka feeding the audience not what they want, but what they need to listen to and hear in order to fight consumerism and enlighten themselves in the process. The influence of percussive sound incorporation and dependency on a specific role came from ritualistic pulls and pits of Africa and Haitian voodoo culture, giving it a sort of spiritual and resurrecting atmosphere to all of the sounds and performances. The performance of Zev channeled the rise of a phoenix, battling its way through the system of cultural traditional shackles and increasing power hunger and dominating forces of the authority that Gaza terrorized its own people, both directly and indirectly. Zev's politics of music and consideration what music is as follows, with a basic structure. What is music really? Is this a professional fused sounds or guitars and synths with vocals added as a philosophical cherry on top? Well, according to Zev, the music and soundtrack could be just a simple conversation, or just a physical fight, or for a matter, anything making an audible sound could fall into the musical category. The music of its nature may please some, it may be atmospheric or pornographic to some, no matter how mundane it sounds. It is simultaneously music for everyone and nobody. You have to respect Zev's vision and philosophy for how non-gatekeeping it is, by showing us how much a selection of tools doesn't matter. It shouldn't hinder anyone's musical dreams and aspirations. Therefore, Zev gave a meaning to a bland sound that generally made its difference in the blend of pop sounds. The music according to Zev gives every scene moment in both movies and real life a context and emotion to follow, and without a sound, there is no context, or very little in real life. Capitalism's effects of money, hunger, depravity has made the man and the machine into one soulless entity, and made the humans much less spiritual in the process. Agricultural industry, according to Zev, dealt with more divine nature and the fear of dying, aka facing mortality, which in hindsight is making humans more vulnerable, grounded and humble in my theory. Despite his bizarre methodology and thinking, Zev was a huge powerhouse in the primal sectors of proto-industrial music and experimental music as a whole. An example of how instead of going above and beyond, going below the steps of music, a structure can be just powerful and meaningful, But most of all, it can be influential despite the singularity, as proved by many copycats later on. Most of the proto-industrial stuff comprised of sound without textures and with a single to no layers of structure. Key component of provocation and agitation being that of playing a static harmony of sorrowfulness and bleakness, representative of decay, corruption, dehumanization, and generally the footing of industrial music lies in opposing rather than conforming. It is not standard music. It is a statement. However, all that would change it and evolve it for something more internationally acceptable and danceable, while still retaining the rebellious and outcast-circle vibe that the industrial music had garnered. A small group of three men, Richard Kirk, Stephen Mallinger, and Chris Watson, who were just digging around with cassette tapes in pubs, while unknown people in the early 70s, UK, took it upon themselves to twist and evolve the industrial genre into unique ways and merge it into a somewhat mainstream sphere. Naming themselves upon a famous Dadaist club in Zurich, the band of Cabaret Voltaire's techniques were leaps and bounds above the rest, with samples from movies, shows, and other media, and most importantly, a dynamic symbolizing an actual rhythm, while still keeping the industrial edge on their neck. Their albums like Grand Mecca and songs like Nag 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 and Yashar provide us as a musical progress and rhythm, not just in elements in tunes, but also in evolution in the genre. Melodies of Middle Eastern elements, avant-garde mix-up in synth-pop, coated in industrial tones, anti-authoritarian visuals and imagery, punk attitude without a punk style. The use of generalized as standard issue instruments, steady riffs, bassy melody, ups and downs. It was no longer static, but at last it was something resembling an actual in-a-box type of music, as if rebellion had made a sacrifice and disguised to the genres of the orthodoxy. Placing bets on experimentation and being diverse with the elements, the Voltaire group saw themselves as technocratic journalists who, despite of creating poppy songs, were actually reporting on atrocities and horrorness of humanity's most darkest corners that media desperately tries to mask behind the curtains of pop and new wave music. This statement applies especially during the early stages of their discography. And on top of that, Cabaret was one of the prominent users of visual/video imagery as subliminal messages to convey a sense of immediacy and abstract mystery flair. In their minds, the video imagery combination effectively gave sense to their music as well as contextualize it, therefore making the statements more clear and actually deliver a message, rather than being needed to be unearthed by professional hands. They were referring themselves as urban and modern primitivists, as also being a natural step above the contemporaries, referring to the evolution from Bronze eras of Grisel, Gazaza, and Zev. The Voltaire group and their music effectively formalized an attack on the body, forming a propaganda of sound that directs the people to fiction of reality, rather than a reality of fiction found in TVs and movies at that time. However, their hail in the industry of industrial music would not be permanent, as Richard Kirk said, implied. They didn't want to be the old mess stuck in a broken record state, elaborating that they would branch and breach themselves in the other genres, but not without completely ditching their work of industrial music completely, as they would merge and mix the genre with our more contemporary hallmarks. Whereas Samurai album Crackdown, Microphonics, and Code would transform into pseudo synth-pop and proto-techno style, which was mixed with industrial undertones. With sufficient and unique hoover cabaret, along with good mixing, provocative undertones, and general poppy trajectory, with a slew of political and oppositional messages, brought fame recognition into the upper parts of the music industry. And although they never recruited themselves with fortune and money or fame, they nonetheless laid the groundwork for artists like Skinny Puppy, FLA, Daft, and many other artists, who would become influential and equally essential in bringing the genre into somewhat mainstream audiences. Unfortunately, Richard H. Kirk has passed away this year, leaving a great legacy behind and a sound behind, which revolutionized the genre of industrial music. Rest in peace. I'm more of a noise musician, meddling on the lines of then beginning industrial music, and being more concentrated on general white noise. Boyd Rice/Non represents itself in the most harshest, unforgiving and twisted way as music can possibly get. Early recordings of Non/Boyd Rice mainly are a subset of the most broad human roughness, threshold of work and pain. Boyd incorporated the sounds of banging, radio static, fan sounds, screaming, and many more, which represents the most gut-wrenching feelings in us, along with a sense of weirdness and recoiling with decomposed disgust. Non's music, or should we say anti-music, focuses on viewers' imagination more than anything else. Boyd critiques and protests the music industry's accepted norm of lyrical efficiency and writing style of the songs and their customeristic nature, making them extremely uninspired and basic, but temporarily satisfying to average listener. Incorporating the similar style to Zeb, albeit more layered, if you could call it that. The instrumentation, specifically the usage of instruments per performance, falls into a singularity pattern, but from track to track it is ensured that a different instrument, radical to the eye and brain, will be played. Most likely the instrument being of course industrial or civilian utilitarian in nature. While less sophisticated and of course less layered than Voltaire, the Non manages to amp up the disturbance and coarse nature of the tracks by including the samples from various events across the world. Stuff from religious ceremonies to government shenanigans were all packaged in Non's catalog. When the performances featured the wings or fangs of Non, the audience had one word written on their backs. That was the rage, and also disappointment if you want to be less extreme. The sounds that lashed out of the albums made the feeling that they were either being whole bored with the tool, or were afloat drifting in a hurricane of words, thoughts, and issues of society. An honest to the ear and background buzzing to but for Boyd it was a filler of his free time, a melodic and catchy serotonin for his brain. We could argue that it stimulates the hallucination side of music quite well, questioning your sanity and perception, which this kind of Boyd's music hides quite well. You may realize that there are recording staples inside the tracks, of pure anguish and tribal lust of agony. It's almost like glaring at a beautiful mind of a psychotic person. The way it coherently moves and sounds, the way it is garbled and how many voices it musters, it all sounds like a very clear rendition of an unclear mind of a schizophrenic/schizoaffective person. Rice's main attraction and catch was the female vocalism of the 60s and 70s, describing them as music by adults for children. The main soothing tool for Boyd was simply the screechy and high tonal nature of the female vocals, and he also expressed the love for ABBA's experimental and weird stuff, which was a huge influence to him. Back in his childhood, Rice and his classmates would hear a sliver of pop songs, such as Sugar Sugar and Dizzy, and none of them would appreciate the cheerful world of his pop tunes, and maybe the artist's sour memories of his songs, and most likely seemed to be his anguish towards himself and his decisions of life, which manifested as a time filler. But, distinctively, it was an arousing edge of provocation to be a musician without a structure, to be a buzzing nuisance, which reflected in Boyd's prankster attitude towards people before starting his career. The practical jokes of the past had become a blazingly chaotic spree of instrumental cries, used in assortment and in ways of pure talentless swinging spree, that somehow sparked a genre of its own across the world. That being said and done, thank you for watching my video, and stay tuned for part 2, which will come, well, eventually, let's say.